discussant and the first presenter with snowflakes on my slides. Before I start, this is.
Pull that direction.
Oh, there we go. That'll do it. Before I start, I have to give a disclaimer. Since I'm at the Securities and Exchange Commission, I have to say that this discussion is my own opinion. It doesn't represent the opinions of anybody else at the SEC. Next, I have a note, which is kind of a second disclaimer, and that is that I have discussed this paper before, and the authors were very responsive to my suggestions, which makes this discussion more challenging. And I thank them for responding to my previous suggestions. So I'll summarize a little bit of the main results of the paper, but Mao did a good job, so I really won't go into a summary of the paper. So the paper says that wider tick sizes encourage competition on speed and hence HFT, and that wider tick sizes do not improve liquidity. And they find some results that seem inconsistent with prior interpretations in the HFT literature. He didn't really expand on that much in his presentation, and I'm not going to expand on it much in my discussion either. But I thought I would start by giving a little context to the paper. Now, Mao mentioned some of the policy issues in tick sizes. So as a quick history of what's been going on in that, this all started with an IPO task force paper in 2011 that looked at why we had this massive decrease in small company IPOs in the US. And they came up with several reasons, one of which was decimalization. So that started this question of whether small companies should have wider tick sizes. Then came the Jobs Act, which required the SEC to do a 90-day study of whether this was true. And as researchers, I'm sure you can think of what can you do in 90 days. So that 90-day study was a literature review. This was followed by a House bill that would create a tick size pilot. This bill, to my knowledge, was not passed by the Senate or signed by the President, but this would create a 5-year pilot on a very narrow set of stocks, and it would allow the issuers to decide whether they wanted to be in the pilot or not. The next item was an SEC order last summer that created a more, what I would call a more scientifically based tick size pilot. In my own opinion, of course. And that ordered the exchanges in FINRA to create a proposal. So they proposed this last summer. It went out for public comment. And that's where it stands right now. But one key thing is that the focus of these developments is on small stocks. It is not questioning whether large stocks should have smaller ticks. It's really on whether small stocks should have larger ticks. So on the policy issue, at least in the US, that's where the debate is. And the paper does provide some results that are specific to small stocks, but those results are not always the same as for large stocks. So that's, I think, important to keep in mind here. And I think when the paper does try to link itself to this policy debate, I think they should focus more on the small stock issues than the results in general. I also thought I'd give some context to the literature. And as we know, most of the tick size literature focuses on sixteenths and decimalization. And at that time, there were day traders that were active, but they basically had to press buttons to trade. And market makers at that time had time and place, last mover, and informational advantages. Today, it is a very different world. We do have a different market structure today. Today, we have high-frequency traders who are much more automated than day traders. And market makers now have few, if any, advantages relative to high-frequency traders. So we are in a different market structure. And I think one thing that this paper could do a little bit better is it could motivate itself and compare itself to the other literature on sixteenths and decimalization in particular, and how today's market structure does deviate from the structure at the time of those analyses, and how this contributes because of that. In addition, there are few results in the existing literature that relate specifically to small stocks. I think Hank has a paper that does, but he's not here today. But he's one of the exceptions. The next thing I'm going to talk about is I'll talk about test design. And one question I generally have in the test design is whether the tests really get at time priority. Now, the incentive to compete on speed is fairly intuitive, but I'm not convinced that the results prove that this is the driver. In fact, I may argue right now that the driver could be price priority. And in particular, the price priority at smaller ticks could be driving these results. And I don't think this is a fatal flaw of the paper. I think there are some simple test design changes that the authors could make to address this issue. The second thing I'll mention, which is a smaller issue, is that I think that the paper draws some conclusions without actually testing for those conclusions. I think that may be more of a pet peeve of mine. Some of these results do look like they could be economically significant, but it would still be nice to cross the T's and dot the I's. And I'll get into that in a little bit with some examples. So to think about price priority driving the results, or the time priority driving the results, first, look at Table 2. This is a portion of Table 2 for large cap stocks. Now in, let's see, it's the pointer. Oops, I'm sorry. When you look at the small tick sizes, what you notice is that non-HFT are at the inside a lot more than HFT are. And this is not what we want to be driving the results if the story is the time priority story. What you would prefer to be driving the results is this 95.9% up there, because this is where you see HFTs and non-HFTs at the inside at the same time. And so the story holds if it's the HFTs that have the time priority at that point in time. Now, another way to think about this table is if we go back to the decimalization time period, and if you change the column headings here, if we think of HFT only as regional stock exchanges, and we take the non-HFT only as New York Stock Exchange, and the HFT and non-HFT is both at the inside, and then our large tick is pre-decimals, small tick is post-decimals, then we had the same results. So what happened is when we were in 16ths, then what we had is the regional stock exchanges matched the New York Stock Exchange quite a bit. And when we went down to a smaller tick size, the New York Stock Exchange was more often at the inside than the regionals. Now, we'd hardly say that the regionals had a speed advantage. So really, I think we need to try to disentangle some of this speed versus price priority. The second way of looking at this, if you compare tables 3 and tables 4. So table 3 is the amount of the depth, or the percentage of the depth supplied by high-frequency traders. And this is across all times. And because of that, it should be highly correlated with table 2. So when the HFT is not at the inside, you should have a 0 depth. So what we do see is you see higher depth when HFT is more likely to be at the inside. And then when you look at table 4, this is looking at the volume of HFTs as liquidity providers. So what I would point out is that HFTs are liquidity providers here 49.96% of the time, but they're providing 55.66% of the depth. So what that tells me is that HFT on average don't have priority. Now, it's important to point out here that this is looking at both the times when they're both at the inside, when HFT is alone, and when non-HFT is alone. So it could be driven by the fact that when you have when non-HFT are alone, they have price priority, and they are alone more often than the HFT. But I would expect that if HFT were establishing priority on average, then they would be supplying more of the volume as liquidity providers than the depth that they're supplying. So in some of the other results, there are some regressions, and I'd argue that the regressions don't really solve this issue. In Table 5, the left-hand side variable is the liquidity provided volume of HFTs. So this is essentially the same as Table 4, except that it controls for a lot of other factors. So it still doesn't really separate them trading when they're both at the inside or when it's the non-HFT that are at the inside alone. So you don't know what's driving it. Table 10 also provides an analysis. And here I think if you look at the left-hand side variable of that, it's really a comparison of the volume when HFT are alone to the volume that HFT are supplying when they're matching non-HFT, and then comparing that to non-HFTs. And so still, when you think about the way that that left-hand side variable is constructed, it could still be driven by the amount of time that non-HFT are alone at the inside. So my next point is that the paper does draw some conclusions without actually testing for those conclusions. So again, I'll bring up Table 2. This time I'll look at the small cap panel. And if you look at Table 2, it shows the columns of HFT only, non-HFT only, and HFT and non-HFT. And it runs a test for whether non-HFT are alone more often than HFT. The conclusions that are in the text, however, look at things like HFTs and non-HFTs are more likely to quote identical prices for stocks with large relative tick sizes. And that's actually not one of the tests that they're running in the table. Well, if you look at those numbers, 34.1 versus 10.7, probably is significant, probably economically and statistically, but it might be nice to actually run the test. The same as the evidence does not support the hypothesis, that the smaller the relative tick size, the higher the probability that the best quote is provided by HFTs rather than non-HFTs. Again, if you look at the number, 70% versus 18.6, or actually 70% versus 54, is that right? Or actually it's a different diff, 52 versus 43. Again, it probably statistically significant, definitely economically significant, but it would be nice to see the test. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the liquidity demand side and distinguishing liquidity supply from liquidity demand. Now, this paper is about liquidity supplying HFTs and the competition to supply liquidity. It's important to note that high-frequency traders do not just use limit orders. They are not only liquidity supplying. And high-frequency traders may trade off execution certainty that you get from market orders with the cost advantage of limit orders when they're making decisions. Also, some strategies may rely heavily on getting that execution certainty and trading very quickly and getting low trading costs. For this reason, when you have higher tick sizes, you're increasing the trading cost when you need that execution certainty. So it's very possible that bigger tick sizes reduce some HFT strategies and liquidity demanding HFT. And the paper does have some tests that support that liquidity demanding HFT declines when you increase tick sizes. But when you look at the general conclusions, the paper sounds as if the conclusions apply to both liquidity supply and liquidity demanding HFT. So I would just suggest being a little bit more careful in deriving that. So I will end with a quick summary of what I've mentioned is in terms of the relevance of the paper to current issues, I would suggest that the paper line itself up with current issues a bit better when drawing implications for those current issues. In terms of test design, I would suggest restructuring some of the tests to really convince the readers that the results are not driven by the non-HFT activity. And suggest that the paper ensures that the tests do support conclusions it draws. And I would also suggest distinguishing liquidity supply and liquidity demand a little bit more carefully. Thank you.